Society President Cheryl O'Donnell noted that Recording Secretary Gary Hevel apparently was having connection problems and perhaps could provide minutes of the October meeting later during the program. Cheryl then requested the information regarding new members for the society from Christina Say. Christina named the following applicants. Unfortunately, I don't have those applicants. I'll have to check back with Christina to get those names. David Adamski noted that the Young Entomologist group is currently dormant for the rest of the year, but will have full activities during 2021, whether virtual or otherwise. President O'Donnell advised that the society is in the process of finishing activities of the past year, and the society officers would present reports at the December meeting. President-elect Jamie Zonizer noted that normally a slate of proposed officers for the following year are presented at the November meeting. He has appointed a few members for an officers selection committee, and that group has been actively pursuing appropriate candidates. A final slate of officers will be provided during the next month by email, and the final election will occur during the December meeting. Program Chair Cecilia Escobar called upon David Adamski for an introduction of the speaker of the evening, Ian Emanuel, who is a member of the Young Entomologist group. Ian was guided by David to begin research on the entomofauna of jack in the pulpits and officially presented the program, Insects Associated with Jack in the Pulpit. There are 5 native species of jack in the pulpits in the northeastern United States. The plants are found mostly around wetlands in rich and moist soils. Associated plants are skunk cabbage and pawpaws. Jack in the pulpits have corms and roots at the base. Plants emerge from the ground with a central spathe first, followed by leaves that unfold. These plants have a remarkable ability in that female plants are capable of reverting back to male plants. Research areas included Cunningham Falls State Park and Mount Briar Wetlands Preserve. Collecting activities included several steps. First, the outside of the plant was checked for insects. A brush was then dipped into alcohol before swirling around the spathe of the plant. Specimens were then placed inside a vial of alcohol, and vials were labeled with locality and collector data. In the lab, insects were identified to family. 35 families of insects were found during the 3-year research, including a few aphids that are undescribed. The majority of insects were Diptera in the families Mycetophilidae, Thyaridae, Psychotidae, and Chironomidae. Some predators, especially spiders and Regiviid bugs, were found. After the program, several viewers noted that the presentation was quite well done. During the presentation, Program Chair Cecilia Escobar emailed Gary Hevel and arranged contact by telephone. Gary noted that he had experienced auditory problems, but presented the minutes of the October meeting by phone. The minutes were approved by attending members. The meeting was adjourned at 7:45 p.m.
Sorry about that, Cece. Does anyone have any changes or amendments to the minutes? Okay, then do I have a motion to accept the minutes as is? A motion? All right, a second? All right, thank you very much. So minutes have been approved as written, as read. All right, our next order of business is introduction of new members and visitors, which that might be our challenge with the visitors at this point, but at least we can list new members. If Christina is available for a report, great. Thank you, Christina.
So we have 2 new members this month. It's Walter Falis and Elizabeth Young, who's actually, Elizabeth Young will be, she's going to be taking actually over my role come the new year. I will also note, unfortunately, due to some website issues, their names are not yet in the database, but I know you're new members. I appreciate you. I saw the dues, etc. So we do have 2 new members. They just need to be just some technical difficulties on my end that we will surmount soon. That's it. Welcome any visitors we might have. If you want to drop your names in the chat, that's perfectly, except we would love to see it. And then, yeah, that's it.
All right. Thank you very much. Anybody have any comments or oh, great. Any thoughts or comments on the Christina's report? All right, so the next order of business is for the presentation by the president of a summary report for the state of the society, which is me. And I will try to be brief, but this report is not brief. So I will be as succinct as possible in reading this. The state of the society is evolving. Last year, 2019, past President Mark Metz stated in his annual report that the society was brewing with potential for the future. I do not think he had the events of 2020 in mind. As the 2020 president, I had several goals I wanted to achieve, and some were met. The society experienced significant challenges in an unprecedented year. The COVID-19 pandemic precautions started in March of this year, and while most of us thought this was a temporary situation, we were forced to face a different reality. In 2020, we began the year with great enthusiasm and held our traditional general meetings at the Natural History Museum in January, February, and March. In April, the Society postponed the general meeting for the first time in history due to a global pandemic. Little did we know at the time, but the general meetings held in person for the remainder of the year would also be canceled due to the pandemic. Even with this unprecedented these cancellations, the Society accomplished a considerable amount. I am honored to have served as the 2020 president, working with the officers as we appointed an ad hoc graduate student liaison, coordinated a student tour of the entomology collections with Floyd Shockley, reestablished an annual budget, developed a website wish list, and hired a web designer. Another positive for this year is that the pandemic forced the society to regroup and think outside of the box by using new technology, a product called Zoom, to hold virtual executive committee meetings throughout the summer. One of the discussions for the committee focused on was how does the society move forward in this new reality? We determined the best way forward was to continue with Zoom virtual general meetings. This is evolutionary and expands the attendance of members and the public at the general meetings, especially for those who have not been able to attend in person in the past. This is our future. Can you imagine what the Society's founding fathers, C.V. Riley, E.A. Schwartz, and L.O. Howard would think of our evolution today? As with past presidents, I have relied heavily on the committee members who do most of the work. Cece, or Cecilia, Escobar served as our program chair, assisted by the graduate student liaison, Kristen Jade. Cecilia arranged and scheduled the 3 in-person speakers and 3 virtual speakers during the general meetings in 2020. She has also organized the speaker for January 2021. These scheduled presentations included meeting announcements sent out to our members and the public in advance of our meetings. Cecilia has adapted to the virtual sessions with grace and has remained steadfast in maintaining continuity from in-person to virtual presentations. 2 presentations focused on systematics, one by Mark Metz on the genus Faculta, and the other on chiggers by Ricardo Bassini Silva. In March, Dr. Don Weber presented a talk on Charles Valentine Riley, founder of modern entomology, and our first Zoom virtual presentation was a short video on the love bugs, Charlie and Lois O'Brien. In November, Cecilia organized an excellent virtual presentation by one of the young entomologists, Ian Emanuel, who provided a virtual presentation on Jack in the Pulpit mystery. In addition, Cece, with the assistance of Christina and Kristen Jade, organized a student tour with Floyd Shockley. The tour was held on March 5th in honor of Charles Valentine Riley and prior to the general meeting. Cece has reported that she will end her term as officer this year. And I thank Cece for her resilience, ability to adapt quickly to our new virtual format, and in her ability to ensure continuity for the society meetings. President-elect Jamie Zahniser planned and coordinated the Society's annual banquet, which was subsequently canceled due to the global pandemic and statewide restrictions to reduce in-person meetings. I thank Jamie for working throughout the year as the statewide pandemic directives were deployed. Much of the decisions to cancel the banquet were decided as new information was announced by the CDC. This year, Jamie organized the auditing and nominating committees, who selected a slate of officers for whom we will motion to approve tonight. I want to thank Jamie for his support and his insights, ideas for the committee, and I look forward to assisting him as the incoming president. Dave Adamski had a full schedule of activities prepared for the Young Entomologist Group, YEG, this year. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, only one presentation was given at YEG workshop on Saturday, February 15th at the Curious Educational Center at the Natural History Museum. The remainder of the YEG meetings for this year were canceled. However, they will begin a virtual education entity in 2021. I wish to thank Dave for his resilience and ability to maintain communication with the YEG members to ensure their enthusiasm does not wane. In addition, I appreciate the work David does to maintain a close relationship between YEG and ESW. I owe a great deal of gratitude to our editor and our past president, Mark Metz, for his knowledge of the proceedings of the Society and as a reminder of our bylaws which guide us. As our editor, maintaining the publications and proceedings is demanding and constant. In 2020, 1,037 pages were published in volume 122, issues 1 through 4, of the proceedings, an increase of 288 pages from 2019. Essentially an additional entire issue's worth of content. These 4 issues comprise of 64 research articles, which documented 10 new genera, 68 species, 4 generic synonyms, 6 species synonyms, 13 new species combinations, and 3 revised higher level classifications. The year's issues also included 21 notes, 2 book reviews, and 1 obituary. Our curator, Nicholas Silverson, has archived and fielded requests for hard copies and back issues. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic and reduced access to the museum, disbursement of issues have been halted. And the Society will have to try to make accommodations for the backlog when the museum archive is accessible. I thank Nicholas for maintaining the current status of who received and did not receive issues during 2020. Our treasurer, Abby Kula, reports that the Society's functional operating budget increased by $100.22. Her report was approved by Auditing Committee on December 1st. I wish to thank Abby for taking care of the Society's finances and for agreeing to serve as treasurer. The Membership and Communications Secretary, Christina Say, reports that she will end her appointment starting January 2021. We thank Christina for her service in maintaining membership records. I wish to thank our long-standing recording secretary, Gary Hevel, who provides the recording for the Society's activities. Gary has shown resilience in being able to quickly adjust and adapt to our new virtual meetings and has maintained recording the Society's activities throughout 2020. So that is my report for today. The full report will be published in the proceedings, and I have received pretty much everybody's report for the committee. Any questions for that report? Thoughts? All right. So our next order of business is the election of new officers. Jamie, would you like to announce the nominated officers?
Well, thanks, Cheryl. So our nominating committee has come up with a slate of nominees. There's one nominee for each elected position in our society. And those nominees are, first, President-elect Lourdes Chamorro, Program Chair Alan Norbaum, Membership and Communications Secretary Elizabeth Young, Curator Nicholas Silverson, he's the current incumbent, Recording Secretary Gary Hevel, also the incumbent, Treasurer Abigail Kula, also the incumbent, and Editor Mark Metz, also the incumbent.
All right. Well, then let's, anybody have any other nominations they'd like to make for this, for the committee members? Okay. Then do we have a motion to accept those that have been slated? A motion that's been granted, a second motion? Yes? Okay, great. Then accepted. We have new members. Thank you, Jamie, very much for announcing and getting the committees together. All right, so the next order of business is unfinished business. Anybody have any unfinished business that we haven't addressed in our last three virtual or our last two virtual meetings? I see there's some chat, but I can't read them, Cece, so as long as there's no...
Just everyone kind of saying hello in the chat.
Okay, okay, good.
All can unmute themselves if they do want to right now.
Okay, all right. So no unfinished business then. We will move on to new business. I don't have anything. Does anybody else have new business? Okay. All right, we can move on to the next topic. Presentation and notes and exhibition of specimens. Presentation of notes. No, it's kind of hard to do exhibition of specimens virtually. All right, presentation of announced topics. I believe this becomes Cece's last duty of the general meetings.
So César, if you want to share screen so I can get you started. I would like to introduce everyone to Dr. César Nufio. He is currently a content developer at HHMI Biointeractive, who brings to his team his experience as an entomologist, a field ecologist, and a museum curator. His research has explored insects in fossil records, the impact of urban fragmentation on insect communities, and the behavior of box flies in desert ecosystems, and the response of grasshoppers to warming in the Rocky Mountains. César is also an adjunct curator at the University of Colorado Museum of Natural History. César?
Thank you, Cece. It's just really wonderful to be able to speak with you all. Cece, you be my ears and eyes. If there's any comments because somebody can't hear me or there's any issue, please jump in and let me know so I can adjust.
No problem.
Thank you. So yes, so I currently work at HHMI Biointeractive, where I get to work with amazing, talented people thinking about the future of education, and I really enjoyed this part of my career. But what I'm going to talk about today is work that I did when I was at the UC Museum of Natural History in Colorado, in Boulder, Colorado. I was there for 16 years, and as Cece said, prior to that, I was at the University of Arizona, where I got my Ph.D., and I actually was an intern at the Smithsonian in about 1996, working in the museum collection. So I'm really looking forward to being able to find my way back into that museum. Let me just set my timer here. So this is just a bit of a landscape of where I come from. Let's see if I can, not sure why, there we go. So at the University of Colorado CU Museum, I was really interested in thinking about grasshoppers as a way to be able to explore the effects of climate change on organisms. And in particular, I was interested in phenology, or the timing of different life history events. So when are things hatching? When are things dispersing? When are things becoming adults in the environment? I was also interested in using them to explore species distributions and how that might change with climate change. And then I was interested in how climate change affects abundance and the behavior of organisms. In particular, I was interested in thinking about the environmental drivers. So, and specifically, how does temperature, precipitation, snow melt, day length, how do those mechanisms or changes in those help influence the timing and the distribution and the abundance of organisms? The other thing I was interested in is thinking about the traits of organisms and how that might affect how they respond. So different grasshoppers, different insects have different thermal biologies. How do those help them adapt or change or acclimate to the different conditions in the environment? I was also interested in life history traits. So how does being a specialist or a generalist affect you? How does body size or the timing of the season for these different species affect their responses? Also, I was interested in things like degrees of local adaptation. There are some species that move about, that distribute themselves quite widely, and there are things that you only find at the top of mountains or that are wingless, so they're not moving about in the environment as much. So we did these types of research, exploring these types of questions, doing field experiments, doing lab experiments, and actually working in the museum collection as well. I wanted to structure this talk today thinking about three main goals. The first is thinking about why are grasshoppers important to grasslands. First, this is an entomology group, and we like to talk about why our groups are important. But also, I found that when I came to Virginia, grasshoppers are not as common and not as dominant as they were in the grasslands of Arizona or Colorado. And so I often have to explain why grasshoppers are important here to communities in Virginia. Then I'd like to talk about Gordon Alexander, who was really kind of a collaborator that I've thought about for a long time, who collected grasshoppers in Colorado in the 1950s and 60s, and who really sparked the interest of mine to become involved as an orthopterist, to learn about grasshoppers and to explore them as an organism to be able to explore climate change. And then we'll talk about a resurvey project, so comparing my findings to what Alexander found in 1958 and 1960. And then we'll explore how the organisms or grasshoppers have changed their phenology, their fitness, and their dispersal. So why are grasshoppers important? Well, in the grassland states, they are extremely important. They're the dominant primary herbivores in these particular communities. They eat more foliage than any mammals, and mammals combined within these grassland ecosystems. And they're thought to consume 6 to 12% of the foliage in the western United States annually. They're so dominant that we actually have the production of hazard maps that are produced every year that basically try to say, hey, where are certain areas where we're going to have a large amount of grasshoppers that we're going to have to deal with because they're going to be important for agricultural systems and for being able to raise cattle. So here is one typical map of 2019, and you can see down below where you see it's color coded, where they're estimating the number of grasshoppers per square yard. And once we start getting to 8 to 15 or 15, that's where we're starting to worry. That's where we're going to know that there's going to be something that we're going to have to do to control their population sizes. So this is the map for 2019, and this is the map for 2020. And all I want to just show you is that they're so important, they're so dominant as primary herbivores that we have to take them into account when we're thinking about agriculture or we're thinking about cattle. Because they are so dominant and they are the primary arthropod biomass in these ecosystems, there's a lot of organisms that depend on them for subsistence. Whether they're vertebrates or whether they're other insects, grasshoppers are going to be your primary source of nutrients if you're eating insects or arthropods. They're also important because they can contribute to ecosystem processes, whether we're thinking about nutrient cycling, so they help with decomposition rates. They're consuming plants. They're also preferentially consuming some plants over others, and they may influence patterns of diversity that you might find in particular ecosystems. The other reason that I really like them as organisms for study is because they're easily collected, they're easy to identify, and they're extremely common. And they're not only common in lowlands, but you can find them in alpine environments as well. They're relatively diverse. So in Colorado, there's 133 different species that I can work with. They vary in their life history traits. So we talked about this a little bit, thinking about their diets, so whether they're specialists or they're generalists, they change their difference in body size, thermal biology. I have lots of different ways that I can take a look at a community of grasshoppers and think about how traits might be influencing their responses. So that's why grasshoppers are really important and dominant in grassland ecosystems. But let me get back to 2001 when I went to the University of Colorado CU Museum. And when I went there, I had just studied boxing flies in desert ecosystems, and I didn't really know one end of a grasshopper from another. I never really paid that much attention to it. But I got to work in the museum, and the museum had just moved into a new facility. And when we moved into the new facility, it turns out that there were 250 boxes of grasshoppers. And you could just open up each box. So these are the boxes that were on top of the cabinets there. And if you open up a box, you might see something like what's at the bottom here. Beautifully preserved, pinned specimens that had labels and all of this information associated with them. So now with the bigger space of the museum, we had an ability to be able to curate them. But what really fascinated me was these 3 data notebooks that came with the collection that were on top of the collection. And going through the different pages, I just thought, oh my God, I know what I'm going to be doing in 5 to 10 years, because this is just an amazing treasure trove of data that was preserved in these data notebooks. But first, what we had to do was we had to curate the specimens. So we got an NSF grant, and then we took all of these 24,000 specimens, we curated them, we moved them into the collection, we geo-referenced them, all of these different sites, and now the data for all of these specimens is available in GBIF and online. We also created a historical and project website. Unfortunately, the server has gone down, and with COVID, it's been a little bit slow to respond. But if you have any questions or anything that you'd like to know, we published in 2009 in the American Entomologist, the history of Gordon Alexander. And I'm absolutely happy to provide any other information. In turn, I love giving these presentations because undoubtedly there's somebody who knows about Gordon Alexander or who has had experience with him. And please contact me. I'd love to learn more by people who might have known him directly or indirectly. The other thing we did was we participated in a scan project where we basically scanned and digitized many of these different grasshoppers that are in the collection, as well as with their affiliated collection data, and those are available online. So that was the first phase that we did. We had to take all of these specimens, move them into the collection. And we had to figure out who Gordon Alexander was. I had to figure out who Gordon Alexander was because, you know, there's all of these specimens that are attributed to him. So one of the big treasures that was actually just as big of a treasure as the specimens in the notebooks was actually finding out about Gordon Alexander and who he was. It just really was one of the things that gave me a great deal of pleasure of learning about his history and learning about his contributions to science. So Gordon Alexander was born in Missouri in 1901. His father was a minister, so he moved about a great deal. And as he moved around, he loved to collect birds, and in particular bird eggs and bird nests. And he actually traded bird nests and bird eggs with amateurs as part of what he liked to do. He also liked to collect fossils. When he went to his undergraduate, he met Marion Isley, who is B.F. Isley's daughter, as an undergrad. And then he, as an undergrad, also worked with B.F. Isley on grasshoppers, and that's how he ended up getting hooked on grasshoppers and thinking about using them as potential specimens. Then he received his Ph.D. in 1930 from Princeton. And this is a picture of him from his graduation from Princeton. And this is his daughter, Anne, who he's holding. And Anne was really wonderful at being able to help me piece together a lot of this history and give us photos of what her father was like, where they lived, and all that information. So in 1931, Gordon Alexander came to the University of Colorado. He was department chair for 20 years during his 30 years there. He was the head of the museum for a couple years because a couple of different museum heads kept getting drafted to war. He was interested in the biology of organisms, in particular birds and grasshoppers, and he was really interested in thinking about what they have to do to live along gradients, and in particular elevational gradients. And at the time, there was a lot of natural history that was being discovered. What organisms are where, what are they eating, what are they doing? And that was a lot of what his work entailed. He also published biology textbooks and keys to the local grasshoppers and their distributions, and he was really interested in the types of habits they might have. In 1959 to 1960, Gordon Alexander conducted an extensive survey. He ended up getting a grant from the National Science Foundation for $25,000. And in this grant, he actually got this field vehicle that you can see on the left here. He got this field vehicle because it was absolutely difficult to be able to get to many sites at the time. And this is what he needed to be able to access those sites. His goal for this project was to document what species were there. So what grasshoppers might you find in the Front Range of Colorado? He was interested in thinking about their distribution. So not only what species were there, but what was their distribution along the gradient and what was their abundance? What were they eating? And in particular, he was also interested in their phenology, or thinking about when are they available? When are they hatching? When are they turning into adults? When are they doing these different phases of their life? These are pictures from the time. I ended up being very fortunate to find a Dr. Don Van Horn, who was credited with a lot of the black and white pictures on many of the publications. And it turns out that he became an illustrator and a watercolor artist. And I found him, and he shared with me all of these different pictures that he took during the time working with Gordon Alexander. Gordon Alexander had hired him to document the project, and so that's why we have these great pictures. In the middle, it's Gordon Alexander, and there's Marion. And if you know Colorado, on the top right, this is Chautauqua Mesa. And then this is Gordon Alexander on the bottom right, Gordon Alexander on the left, and then John Hilliard, and then Gordon Alexander's daughter, who was out collecting with them. And then this was a foreign exchange student, but there was no name associated with him in the picture. So this big project, this 3-year project that they created, led to a monograph. And it was a pretty large monograph that documented the species that were found of grasshoppers along the Front Range. And he provided us with information such as the species that were there. And if you see on this table, you can see the elevational belt. So the different elevational ranges in which you might find these species. R means resident, so these are species that actually can complete their whole life cycle at these particular elevations. And A means accidental, which simply means you might be able to find them there, but they can't complete their life cycle there. They're likely from lower elevations that are moving up in elevation, and that's why you find them there. And then the bottom, you see some of the figures that they produce for different species, which basically shows when were these species hatching in white and when were they turning into adults in black. So a lot of really great natural history about the types of specimens that were there. In addition to this, and in the notebook data, which we'll see in a little bit, it turns out that there were 8 sites that they surveyed on a weekly basis. And what this means is that once a week, every 5 to 7 days, they went to one of these 8 sites. They did sweep netting at the different sites, and they stayed there for about an hour, and then they sorted the grasshoppers, and then they wrote down what developmental stages the different grasshoppers were in, what species they were, and what were their abundance. We'll look at that data in a little bit. But these were 4 sites that were close to Chautauqua Mesa and Boulder, and then there was Chautauqua Mesa A1, B1, and C1. Okay, from the foothills to the subalpine. So this was the data that I saw when I looked at the data notebooks. Each of the different pages was for each notebook was for a different year. And so this is just a particular page. This is collection number 14 that year. It was June 24th, 1958. It has a list of the collectors at the time, Dr. Gordon Alexander, John Hilliard, Don Van Horn, and Kathy Alexander. So these are the people that were collecting. This was the site. This was station 1A at elevation of 7,000 feet. This is the collection time, and then a little information about that particular day. And then if you look here, these are the 3 different subfamilies of grasshoppers, and then you can see that here's the list of grasshoppers that were present during their collection on June 24th. And grasshoppers have 5 developmental stages before they reach adulthood. And so what they've done here, so this is June 24th, you could see that Melanopus confusus, he found 5 adult males and 3 adult females. Confucius is an early species, so by June, these guys are adults. And then this is another species, Melanopus mexicanus, which is now Melanopus sanguinipes. At this time, on June 24th, they found 3 4th instar males. They found 1 4th instar female. They found 2 3rd instar males. They found 1 2nd instar males, and then 2 1st instars. So this is fantastic. Each of these different pages records a particular moment, June 24th, and what was happening at these particular sites developmentally for these grasshoppers. So we have abundance data, we have development data. And if we take this data and we take one species, for example, here's Heterotetex viridis, and we think on the left here, it's date. So it's June 9th to September 24th. These are the different collecting dates in which they caught this species, Heterotetex viridis. And then on the right, it's the total number of specimens they collected of this species during that particular collecting date. And then if we look from 1 to 6, we could see the developmental stage of those grasshoppers during that particular time. So this is wonderful. And not only do we get to know the number of grasshoppers that were available during a particular collecting event of a particular species, but if we put all of these pages together, we could see that developmental trajectory of those grasshoppers in that particular year at that particular site. To add to that just amazing data, it turns out that 4 of these stations that he surveyed were actually associated with weather stations. That's why they were called A1, B1, and C1. It's weather station A1, weather station B1, weather station C1. This is really wonderful. I'm getting the ability to see what grasshoppers were there in that particular day. What was their abundance? What was their sex ratio? What developmental phase were they in? And I get to connect that to weather data of that particular time. And those weather stations have continued to collect weather station over the last 60, 70 years now. And they were put there at different sites because they represented different life zones. And they were put there by Dr. John Marr, who was an alpine biologist, but was really interested in what is it about climate that affects the distribution of plants that he sees. Okay, so let's get back and think about this data. So looking at that particular notebook when I was there, what is it that this data provides us an opportunity to study? So first, we have lots of different communities. We have 4 that we'll look at, but we had 8 different communities. So we have multiple different communities that we can look at 50 years ago and then think about what's happened to them now. We also have communities, so it's not just a species, we have all of these different species that are at a particular site. And this is really important because most studies that get published and they're looking at one species, they typically find that most species are changing as a response to climate change. We don't tend to publish negative results, right? But when we look at community level analyses, it turns out that 25% of species are not really responding to climate change. Why? Well, having access to communities, we can ask those questions and think about why these species differ and why certain species are responding and others are not. The other thing that we have is we have data that's for different developmental stages. Most studies of climate change and thinking about phenology, they're typically thinking about a particular stage. So they're thinking about when are these organisms hatching, when are they becoming adults, when are they laying eggs, or when are they migrating? And here we have really great developmental data that we can connect to climate. And finally, we have that weather data. We have weather data from each of these different sites that Alexander collected in, so we can compare what the weather was like 50 years ago, how it has changed today, and then how the phenology of grasshoppers has changed, how their fitness has changed, and how maybe their dispersal patterns have changed as well. So in 2007, we got an NSF grant to be able to go back and redo this survey. And what we did is we basically used the same methods that Alexander did. On the left is Hilliard and his team, and they're surveying Chautauqua Mesa. On the right is our new team, Erica, who helped with the new survey. But we just went back to the same sites. We surveyed the grasshoppers just like they did. We visited each site once a week from May to June and up to September. May to June, because as you move up the mountain, the season starts later and later. So it starts in May down below, and at the top, we're not really starting the season until June. We swept the grass for about an hour, just like they did in their particular notes. And then I walked around for about a half an hour, just noting the grasshoppers that I was encountering. Also recorded the presence of the species that were there, the life stages and their abundances, just like Alexander did. And then we took this data and we compared it to the weather data back then and now to see how things have changed. And then we compared this phenological data to the climate data, and we looked at fitness and dispersal as well, which we'll talk a little bit more about. So I'd like to just slow down and talk about this table because I think we're going to return to this table quite a bit, and it's important that we sort of see it. By the way, do you see my pointer as I'm moving it? Awesome. Okay, so the first thing to note is that even though I've surveyed 4 sites periodically from 2006 to 2015, I'm only going to show you the data from 2006 to 2012 because I think that's sufficient. And also because we have data for 4 of the sites, it turns out 4 other sites have mostly disappeared. I'm going to just show you data for 3 sites to not overwhelm you with so many different numbers. And I think this really will help us. So the first site is Chautauqua Mesa. This is our low elevation foothill site. Our second site is B1, which is the montane site. So it's higher, middle of the mountain. And then station C1, which is our subalpine site. These are the different species that we find, and these are the species that were residents during Alexander's time and are residents currently here at Chautauqua, here at B1, and here at C1. This is ordinal date, and ordinal date just simply means the day of the year. So January 1st is 1, and December 31st is 365. So this is, what we did was we created a curve and basically tried to figure out the ordinal date at which we might estimate that the grasshoppers were turning into adults during Alexander's time. So if we're estimating during Alexander's 1959 and 1960 surveys, we would estimate that Confucius was turning into adults about day 161. Okay, so this is just what we're just assuming that this is the day that they're likely to have become adults. In 2006, we don't have any data here for Chautauqua Mesa. We didn't really get money until 2007, but I got out early in 2006 for a couple of other sites because I was super anxious to get out there and find out what was happening. So what we're going to do first is just look at the weather data. How did the weather data change during Alexander's time relative to ours now? So if we look at the data from 2006 to 2008 and we compare it to the 10 years around when Alexander was collecting, it turns out that for Chautauqua Mesa, lower elevation site, there was no significant increase in temperature. And climate modelers and climate change, people who work on climate in Colorado says, well, it makes sense. Even though Boulder is actually a high desert environment, in the last 50 years, we planted lots of trees. We brought in a bunch of water. We put in grass, and likely that's really buffering changes in temperature relative to 50 years ago. If we go to the middle of the mountain, on average, if we're thinking about the average temperature from May to August at B1, it turns out that each day was warmer in these 3 years on average by 1.65 degrees Celsius. That's daily, so that's not just the average. So that's tremendous. We actually had a pretty warm time. C1 on average, our 3 years to 10 years of Alexander's, around Alexander's collecting time, it's about 1.4 degrees Celsius temperature increase. So what has happened with the grasshoppers at this time? So if we look phenologically, I'll explain the data a little bit. So 12, if it's red, it means that these grasshoppers are advancing. They're turning into adults earlier than they did at Alexander's time. If it's blue, it means it's delayed by a certain amount of time. So if we look here for Melanopus confusus, it turns out that there was no real difference. And by no real difference, I'm just assuming 7 days. It's within the same week, so I'm not going to register it. I'm not going to put in a number. So it turns out that Confusus was turning into adults about the same week that it did during Alexander's time. So was Clavatus and so was Veridus. If we're thinking about Sanguinipes, however, it turns out when we create the little curves that it was earlier by about 12 days in 2007, and then Dawsoni was earlier by about 2 weeks, okay? And then this one was delayed, Bivateus was delayed by about 8 days. And then when it came to 2008, there was no difference. The grasshoppers were basically turning into adults the same week that they did during Alexander's time. I found that to be extremely fascinating, but it makes sense because really we haven't really warmed very much at Chautauqua Mesa. If we go to the middle of the mountain or the montane, we can see that these grasshoppers were turning into adults almost a month early, 25 days, and maybe even 2 weeks earlier than they did during Alexander's time. And that's where we've actually seen a bit of more warming. The next year, we found still a little bit more of a delay, but here's 2 species that just were turning into adults at the same time as Alexander's time. And then in 2008, it was just this middle block of species that were really advancing. And the same pattern was found for C1, where we found a lot of advancement the first week, the first year in 2006, but not so much in 2007 and 2008. And actually, relatively speaking, they were cooler years than 2006. Okay, great. So we do see that when it's warmer, these guys are advancing. So what happens in the next 3 years? Well, it turns out that we went through a bit of a cool phase. And it turns out that even though it was relatively cool, it was actually slightly cooler than it was in Boulder than it was during Alexander's time. And likely again, because we brought in water, we brought in trees. And so we're just a little bit cooler on an average year. And then you see that all of these species were a bit delayed. And then you see in the middle of the mountain that all of a sudden they're just turning into adults the same weeks that they were during Alexander's time. And a bunch of the pattern we've actually missed higher up in the mountain. And so it was extremely fortuitous that I started the study in 2006, because if I started it in 2009, I would be thinking that grasshoppers are not responding to our ideas of climate change. So, okay, great. So on warm years, they're advancing. On cooler phases, they're not advancing very much, and likely they're bouncing back to the time of Alexander. So what this is showing us is that there's a phenotypic plasticity. They're responding to temperature, but they're very responsive. They just haven't evolved to develop much faster than they once did. So 2012 was a fortuitous year to survey, because it turned out that 2012 was the second hottest year in 118 years in Colorado. So what were these grasshoppers doing? Well, it turns out that the whole mountain was advancing tremendously relative to Alexander's time. And we found that even at Chautauqua Mesa, where we didn't find such an advancement before, we're finding grasshoppers turning into adults 26 to 30 days earlier than they did during Alexander's time. And here we found a species that turned into an adults clavatus 52 days earlier than it did 50 years ago. So that was tremendous. All of a sudden, this whole ecosystem, plants, insects, all of these things were advancing tremendously from this warming in 2012. And if we think about the IPCC estimates of how much we might warm by the end of the century, it turns out that this second warmest year is very close to the mean prediction from the IPCC. So maybe this is what we could accept if we're thinking about that time period. Okay, so what explains this warming? Because all I've shown you right now is the idea of adults, the timing of adults. And what we can do, and as entomologists, this is what we think about, this is what we've been tested on in our particular classes, is we think about, these guys are ectotherms, right? So we think about that temperature affects the development of ectotherms. So in this figure, we might see temperature. So we're going from the left to right, and we're warming things up, okay? And then when we go on the y-axis, we're basically thinking about developmental rate, or how fast they're developing, from going from first instar, second instar, third instar, fourth instar, fifth instar, and then turning into adults. So we're thinking about developmental rate, or we're thinking about performance. How fast are these insects metabolizing, eating, or moving around in their environment? And we're thinking about that in relationship to temperature. First, we think about base temperature. A base temperature for most insects, it could differ for different insects, but for these grasshoppers, it turned out that a base of 12 degrees Celsius worked out really well for us. And what we think about with this base temperature is, below this base temperature, it is too cold. There's no development going on for the grasshoppers. There's no performance. Basically, they're just staying still. The temperature is too cold. We need to get to at least the base temperature of 12 in order for development or performance to be initiated. And once we get past that base 12, we can imagine that we increase the rate of development, we increase the rate of their performance, moving about, feeding, doing all of these different activities, until we get to this C max, this temperature max. And this is an upper threshold in which all of a sudden the organism starts becoming stressed. And though I'm showing it as a linear relationship here, it's not, it's more curvilinear, but this is just to get the point across for this process. So once we get to 12 degrees Celsius, the temperature minimum, then we can start development. And we can increase the rate of development until we get to the T max. And then all of a sudden we have no development and no performance because the organism is stressed. And what we could do with this information is we can try to convert it to some type of metric of how much energy is available to grasshoppers or plants or whatever ectotherm we're thinking about on a particular day. And this is what we call our growing degree days. In growing degree days, we calculated a little bit more sophisticated than this method, but this is basically the method of how you calculate the number of growing degree days that occur or are available to an organism for development or performance during a particular day. And what you just basically do to determine the growing degree days is you take the average temperature of a particular day and you subtract it from that T base. And for us, that T base is just that 12 degrees, right? So for example, we have a day where we have 18 degrees Celsius and our T base is 12. So for that particular day that we had 8 degrees Celsius, it turns out that we've accumulated 6 growing degree days for development for an organism. The next day, for example, it's 20 degrees. We subtract 12 from 20 and we have 8 growing degree days that are available on that particular day. The next day is cooler. It's only 13 degrees Celsius. We subtract 12 from 13. We get 1 growing degree day that's available for development or performance for that particular organism. Another day, it's all of a sudden cooler. It's lower than our 12 degrees Celsius, and we're not gonna go back in their development or performance. So we're just gonna say there's 0 degree days available for development or performance for that organism. Okay, so this is basically how we can estimate the amount of energy that's available for development for organisms during a particular day. Sorry here. And what I did, so if you're a farmer, if you're in extension, if you're a pest person, you are totally aware of growing degree days and you value growing degree days. And you can go online and find growing degree day calculators. And this is where I got this particular data from. And this data, I just Googled a site that helped me calculate growing degree days. And this site was for corn in Illinois. And then it said, choose your location. And then I chose a location and it says, great, we're gonna match you up with weather data that's close to that location. And I'm gonna help you determine the growing degree days that have accumulated for corn. And here they're assuming that the T min, the lower threshold that you have to exceed, is 28 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay, so I was using 12 Celsius, they're using 28 degrees Fahrenheit here. And what I could do is I could just click off these different things that I might be interested in. So what accumulated growing degree days means is just I'm taking that growing degree days that occur, the 6, 8, 1, and 0, and I'm just adding them. So on the first day I had 8, I had 6. I add 6 plus 8, so the next day I've accumulated 14. I have 14 on day 2. I'm going to add 1 to 14, so then day 3 I have 15. And so what we see here is an accumulation of energy that's available for development for corn, because that's what they're interested here. And so what you could see here is that before I get to the middle of April, I am below that threshold, so I'm not accumulating any energy. So there's no energy available, no growing degree days available for corn to be able to develop. So you can plant it, you can do whatever, but it's not going to grow. And then in mid-April, all of a sudden it starts warming. We're getting days that are exceeding that threshold, that 28 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we start accumulating energy in that particular environment. And so we accumulate energy, all of a sudden it's summer, it's warmer, each day is warmer, so our rate of accumulation increases. And then all of a sudden we start getting to November and December and we start getting cooler. So we start accumulating growing degree days or the amount of energy available for development at a slower pace. So in purple, what we see is the average from 1981 to 2010. This is how growing degree days accumulates in this particular site in Illinois. And in blue is the variance, right? So not all years are the same, but this is sort of what you can expect. And what I did in this particular date, and this was, I believe it was 2018, I just chose a particular date when I logged in, and it turned out that that date was in the middle of June. Okay, so here's the middle of June. This is how many growing degree days have accumulated in 2018. It was a warmer than average year. And we haven't gotten to the rest of the year, but the program actually makes an estimate of how growing degree days may accumulate based on the pattern. Okay, so why are we interested in this? Why are we interested in this energy? Well, it turns out that farmers, pest managers, all of these different people that are studying these organisms in the environment have figured out that if you know growing degree days, you can predict certain stages of development of insects that you might be interested in, pests, as well as plants. So in this case, for example, silking, farmers have figured out that if you get to 1400 growing degree days, so this is how many you've accumulated in the environment, that's when you get corn to begin silking. So if you're going to spray to be able to get pests that are really going to get in there in that corn when the corn is silking, you don't have to spray all year. You just are mindful of when you get to 1400 growing degree days, because that amount of energy leads to silking in corn. And then if you're a farmer and you're thinking, well, when am I going to grab my crop? When am I going to start collecting that particular corn? Well, they grow them in the labs and in the field. And then it turns out that once we get to 2700 growing degree days, it turns out that corn starts to get this black layer. It's mature. We can harvest it. Fantastic. So now we've been able to take this energy, this thermal minimum and this thermal maximum, we've been able to turn it into energy that might be available for development for an organism. We can accumulate, we can figure out how much energy an organism requires to reach a particular stage. And we could create these great tools for farmers that are very helpful for them. When should I plant? When should I spray? When should I harvest? And now there's all sorts of apps that farmers can actually download on your particular phone. You could tell them what site you're at. So where am I? And it will connect to local weather station. And then you could choose what type of pest that you are interested in. And so here's bagworms, here's the ash borer, here's the tent caterpillar, here's the Japanese beetle, and it tells you how many growing degree days for them to reach vulnerable stages. Fantastic. Farmers have been using this, pest managers have been using this for a long time. So what I'm trying to do is going to apply this to try to think about what's happening to the grasshoppers along this gradient. So I'm not sure where those lines came from, but art. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take one of these different sites, I'm going to take 3 different species, and then we're going to look at how we can use growing degree days to understand these particular patterns. So, I think Joe is our artist. Okay, so what we have here is, this is B1, this is weather station B1. Here's 3 different species. Here is in 2006, it was out, this species was out about a month early, 2 weeks early. This was delayed by about 10 days. Here it came out the same time, these 3 years that it did during Alexander's time. And in 2012, it was a month early, right? So we're looking at these different patterns of when these things are turning into adults relative to Alexander's time. And we know that they're variable from year to year. How do we use growing degree days to look at this? Well, the first thing we can do here is think about ordinal date. I'm going to plan it with ordinal date first. And again, this is the x-axis, and one is January 1st, and 365 is December 31st. And so this is just the time, the day of the year. We're just turning it into a number. And then this is the index of development. And so what the index of development is, what was the average stage of development that the grasshoppers were when we went and surveyed them on a particular day? Okay, so if The average phase was 1. That means that's the first instar. On average, individuals were first instar. They just hatched. If we went to 4, for example, on average, the grasshoppers that we surveyed were about developmental stage 4. Okay, and if they were 6, that means they're adults. Okay, because they can't go any further. So on average, individuals are going to be all adults by that particular time period. So what I did was I color coded each year by how warm it was during that particular year, or how many growing degree days had accumulated. So if it's red, which is, here's our little bar here, if it's red, that means it was a warmer year. If it's blue, it means it's a cooler year. So what we can look at here is, here's our developmental trajectory, because Alexander collected on a weekly basis, so did I. The dark blue signifies Alexander surveys, and then the other colors are the new surveys. And what we could see is that if it's a warmer year, we get a shift. We get a shift where these grasshoppers are developing, are hatching earlier, and they're becoming adults earlier. So this is the developmental trajectory. They're becoming adults earlier. Okay, all we know here is the amount of energy that accumulated by the end of the season. That's all we're getting. And so here's one species, Boulderensis. Here's another species, Pellucida. On cooler years, it's hatching later and it's turning into an adult later. On warmer years, it's hatching earlier and turning into adults earlier. Okay, so this is just a pattern if we're thinking about how warm a particular year is and the trajectories of their development. But what if we took that ordinal date and we turned it into growing degree days? The amount of energy that had accumulated and has been available for development for these grasshoppers. Can I do a better job at predicting the developmental stage of that particular population? And this is what the pattern looks like. So on the x-axis again is growing degree days. How much energy has accumulated at a particular time of the year? And then on the Y is the index of development. So again, when are they hatching is about 1, and then 6 is when they're turning into adults. And in blue, I basically took all of Alexander's data and I threw it in based on his climate data. And then in black are all of the years of my data from 2006 to 2015. And what you could see is that if I know how much energy has accumulated in the environment, I could predict really well what developmental stage those grasshoppers are going to be. Okay, so our R squared here is 0.85. So tell me how much energy has accumulated. I have a pretty good guess about what developmental stage that population of grasshoppers are going to be of that particular species at that particular site. This is the second species, Pellucida. It gets better. Almost 90, the R squared is 90, 0.89. And I basically can predict really well what developmental stage a particular population will be if I know how much energy is accumulated. And then it gets even better for Dawsoni. So we're going from a species, the first species is an early season species, and then Dawsoni is a late season species. So let's work backwards. If we know how much energy has accumulated in the environment at a particular time, we know what developmental stage the grasshopper population is going to be. If it's a warmer year, that it's going to be that trajectory, we just see that trajectory happening earlier. And then if we go, and what does this mean? If we go back to just thinking about the timing of adulthood of a particular species, so this is just a number, right? This is 20 days earlier, 22 days earlier. This happened because the year was warmer and because the amount of energy required to reach adulthood occurred earlier. Fantastic. This is a really great ability to be able to track the mechanism of climate change. So the other thing that we explored here is that, so we're able to connect growing degree days to changes in phenology. And because it's warmer now, grasshoppers are developing much faster than they did before. So here's another interesting pattern that we found. So this is elevation. So we're moving up higher and higher along the gradient. And here's the amount of growing degree days that occur at a particular site. And what you can see is here's Chautauqua, our low elevation site. Here's C1, which is our higher elevation site. And as we move higher along the gradient, the number of total growing degree days, or the amount of energy that accumulates in the environment, decreases in a particular year. And that kind of makes sense because the average temperature is lower, the season starts later, the season ends earlier. And so, but this gives you an idea about how much energy is available for development for grasshoppers if they are in different parts of the mountain. Okay, so I want you to take a look at this. And so the first, just to get you oriented, in the dotted lines here, this is during Alexander's time, what that curve looked like. And then this is what the curve looked like, how many growing degree days have accumulated along the mountain during our new survey years. Some years, these are the cooler years, and these are the warmer years. And the one thing that I want you to think about, because I did not know here at the time, is if there's less energy for you to become an adult higher in the mountain, do you think a particular grasshopper species will require the same amount of energy to become an adult if it's found in these different sites? Do you think it will require less energy, or do you think it will require more energy as you move up the mountain? So think about it this way. There's a grasshopper that you find at Chautauqua Mesa. You also find it at A1, you find it at B1, and you find it at C1. As you move up the mountain, there's less energy available for development. How much energy will that grasshopper need for development? Will it change or will it be the same? Just going to give you a lock in that hypothesis. What do you think? Well, it turns out that as you move up the gradient, the amount of energy available for development decreases, and the amount of energy the grasshoppers need for development also decreases linearly, which was just fascinating. And here's, it goes to 800, so we're only about here in this particular graph. So this is sort of blowing up here. But what you could see is that all of these different species that are found higher and higher on the gradient are requiring less and less energy to hatch and to become adults. How are the grasshoppers doing it? And this is really interesting because this is how we can think about other gradients that we might find plants or other organisms in. And it turns out they're doing it in a couple of ways. First, some of these grasshoppers are just getting smaller as you move up the mountain. So they're requiring less energy because they're not reaching the body sizes that they did lower down in the mountain. Another thing that they're doing is they're becoming darker. So this is Xanthopus that we find at B1 versus Xanthopus that we find at Chautauqua. And it turns out that they're getting not only smaller, but they're getting darker, which might allow them to heat up faster. Are there other things that grasshoppers might be doing along this gradient? Well, it turns out from different studies on grasshoppers found at colder environments are becoming more efficient at processing food. They're also changing their behavioral thermoregulation. They're spending much more time warming themselves higher in the mountain than they are down below. They're also increasing their metabolic rate. So these are the same species that you might find along a mountain or a gradient. They're also trading off longevity versus development time. So I'm going to develop faster, but I'm going to live a shorter amount of time. So it's pretty interesting that along this gradient, there's less energy. Grasshoppers are requiring less energy, but they're doing all sorts of trade-offs to be able to do that. Okay, so from our study, we find that basically warming has been elevation dependent. It has not been uniform along the mountain, and different communities have behaved differently depending on where they are and what year, because there's also a lot of that temporal variation. And then we also find that growing degree days are a really good predictor of the phenological stage of these different grasshoppers. And that if we know how many growing degree days have accumulated, we can guess really well where they are developmentally. So it's a really great mechanism to be able to study climate change. So just briefly, because I see that I'm kind of running out of time here. So briefly here, if we go back, let's think about fitness as well, because we've been talking about phenology. We've been talking about the development of these grasshoppers, but how are they doing? Are they doing well? Are they doing better when it's warmer or when it's cooler? So we looked at fitness in a couple of different ways. The first thing to imagine, though, is that if we're lower in the mountain, we're actually closer to the thermal maximum for these grasshoppers. So we're already in the warmer range of what their grasshopper biology might be able to stand. And if we're higher in the mountain, we're actually in the cooler range of what these grasshoppers might experience. And what we found was that at the base of the mountain on warmer years, like 2012, on warmer years, the warmer it was, the fewer grasshoppers we actually had. So warming was bad at the bottom of the mountain. Grasshoppers were living for a shorter amount of time, and there were fewer of them. If we went to the top of the mountain, however, grasshoppers loved it. That was a boom year for grasshoppers. Not only was their abundance higher in that particular, in the warmer years, but they were much more abundant, and they actually lived longer. So is climate change going to be detrimental to grasshoppers? It's going to depend on where you are. I think in warmer environments, it may be very detrimental. In cooler environments, they may actually benefit from that particular warming. So the other thing to keep in mind, though, is that not all grasshoppers in a particular community might behave the same way. So here are thermal performance curves, and here are grasshoppers that we find, 3 grasshopper species that we find along the gradient. And what we can think about this graph is, again, this is temperature down below, and this is performance. So performance might be, in this case, it's movement, locomotion, moving about, but it could be the amount of how fast they feed or how fast they develop. And again, here's that C max. We need to get to that particular temperature to start development or start that performance. And then we warm it up. They're doing much better. They're moving about, they're locomoting, they're eating much better until we get to a max. And then all of a sudden it starts getting warmer and their performance starts to decrease until they reach this T max where all of a sudden they get stressed out. So we can apply this to different grasshoppers that we might find at a particular site. So boulderensis, for example, is a species where, so what we did in these experiments is we kept these grasshoppers in growth chambers. And then we kept them there for an hour, and then we let them out, and then we let them jump 5 times. So we scared them, we let them jump 5 times. We've dropped a penny each time they hopped, and then we measured the distance that they hopped. Okay, how much distance did they travel in 5 hops, based on the different temperatures that we had put them in. And then it turns out that these are just different populations because we were exploring that. But what I'm trying to get at here is this is an increase in temperature on our x-axis, and this is the distance that they traveled in those 5 jumps. And what you can see in boulderensis is that it's actually a low temperature specialist. At this cool temperature, they did good, they did well. And then, we see their thermal performance. They did really well. And about 25 degrees Celsius, they did really well. They hopped as far as they could. And then when we started to get to the hottest temperature, which is 35 degrees Celsius, all of a sudden we're getting towards that maximum. We're reducing their performance because it's getting too warm for them. So here's a species that's cool adapted. What about Pellucida? Well, it turns out that Pellucida is a warm adapted species. When we pulled out Pellucida at 10 degrees Celsius and we tried to get it to hop, it just fell over. It didn't move. It was too cold for that particular species. But even at the warmest temperature that we had, the 35 degrees Celsius, it was still hopping. So we hadn't gotten to a threshold. So this is a warm adapted species. So here we go. We have boulderensis, cool adapted, and then we have Pellucida, which is a warm adapted species. So what's Sanguinipes? Well, it turns out that Sanguinipes is a generalist. It did relatively well at the low temperature, and it was doing well at the highest temperature. So what we can think about here is that when we're thinking about performance and we're thinking about a community of grasshoppers and we're thinking about them advancing phenologically, that's one thing. But if we're thinking about their performance, their ability to locomote, their ability to reach that thermal threshold because of warming, well, each species is going to behave differently, and it's going to depend on their thermal performance curve. So fitness will vary depending on the thermal performance curve of a particular species. So let's see, how much more time do I have?
Just a little bit more.
Okay, just a little bit more. I'm always so optimistic here. So I'm going to just go through real quick here and just say that this is a site, this is C1 at the highest elevation site. And what we did was we did an experiment with boulderensis. 2 RU interns built these cages on different years. And then we put grasshoppers in these particular cages. We put 56 females and 20 males, and we divided them amongst these different cages. We marked them, so we put this paint on them, and then these 2 interns pulled them out every 3 days, and then they weighed them. And what we were trying to figure out is how many times are they dropping egg pods, because we figured out in the lab about how much weight they lose when they deposit an egg pod, and what was their survival like in the field. So again, we compared this warm year versus this cold year, and again, we're higher in the mountain, we're at the highest site. What we found was that this highest site, so again, 2012 was the second warmest year on record for Colorado, and 2015 was about an average year. And what we found was that females were actually larger in 2012 than they were in 2015. They did better on that warm year higher in the mountain. They also lived longer. So if we're thinking about once you put them into the cage at time 0, and this is sort of their survivorship curve, this is 2015, the cool year. This is 2012, the warm year. And it turns out that on the warm year, these females lived 48 days on average. And on the cool year, they only lived 29 days on average. And this actually matched the survey data that we were doing out in the field. So that was pretty surprising. And then when we looked at the number of eggs that they, clutches that they deposited, it turns out that on warm year, they deposited more clutches than they did on cooler years. So this is another way of looking at fitness. And it turns out if you're at top of the mountain, they're doing really well on warm years. If you're at the bottom of the mountain, you're not going to be doing very well. Okay, I'm going to skip over most of this information here and just sort of summarize. We have year-to-year variation. Growing degree days is a really good predictor. When we think about grasshoppers on gradients, we can think of them as not responding similarly as they did at one particular site. They're requiring different amounts of energy. They're going through different types of trade-offs, different parts of the mountains. And then what I wanted to do really briefly is just acknowledge that this has been a tremendous amount of work by a lot of different people. And in particular, Lauren Buckley has been an amazing person that I think of these organisms as a name, an ecology, a grasshopper, and she thinks about them as cylinders that have certain types of property based on their size and their color. So she's really helped me to develop this project tremendously. But finally, before I just end, I just want to say that I have to thank Gordon Alexander, because I would never have had the idea. I would never have been able to initiate a project had it not been for him and his insight and the work that he has done. And that's something that I really cherish, and I think I really value tremendously as an entomologist. Collections, natural history collections, survey data, absolutely wonderful sets of data that we can use and explore to be able to determine how environmental change affects the organisms as all of this change is happening now. This is just a picture of Gordon Alexander celebrating his birthday at his cabin in Colorado in 1961. And I'll leave it there, and then if there's any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Thank you so much. So yes, anyone is able to unmute if they have any questions, or you could drop it in the chat and I will say them out loud.
I have a question for you. Do you have material or information on plant composition during the time of Alexander's collections and yours, and the changes that might exist in that composition?
So there were surveys that were conducted at those sites of plants, but unfortunately, it's mostly occurrence data. It's not phenological data. So people have gone back to those particular sites and looked at the plants and what they're doing. And there has been a composition change, but phenologically, unfortunately, I did not have most of that data. but I am working with, and down below here, what we started to do at the top elevation is I started to have students work on a project where, while I'm surveying grasshoppers at the subalpine site, they are surveying the plants. And so now we have 10 years of plant data at this subalpine site, and we have the 12 years of grasshopper data. And we have compared them, and we're working on a paper on that. And it turns out that when I said warming was tremendous and really good for the grasshoppers, it turns out that it's very bad for the plants. So the plants are smaller on warmer years, and they're producing fewer flowers.
And then we have a question from the chat, John Gleason. You mentioned half the sites from 1958 to 1960 that were surveyed were lost now. What happened? Development?
Oh, I love this question. So what ended up happening was that we had great pictures of all of these sites, but things had changed tremendously. And some of the sites, one site, for example, there was so many invasive species. And it turns out that prairie dogs moved into the site because they didn't have other places to go. So they just tore the place to shreds. One site we lost, prairie dogs just ate it to the ground. Another site, for example, this was a site that says 2.5 miles south of Boulder. And I kept driving around trying to figure out where it was, because this is 50 years ago. What is 2.5 miles south of Boulder? So what I had to do is I had to print this photo, and then I drove down the main road, and I kept getting out of the car, and I kept trying to match it to the mountains. And then it turns out that it's Fairview High School. And I actually worked with a student there, and we just published a paper on grasshoppers and dispersal from Fairview High School. So it got me a ticket to be able to go to Fairview. And then there was another site that actually a road was built that went right through it. So it just disappeared. So, you know, it's fortunate that the ones that were preserved are still there. 4 of the sites are still there, and that they were along that elevational gradient.
And then we have another question from Joe Francis. Are these grasshoppers all generalist herbivores?
You know, it's hard to know. So when you look at each of these different species, they'll tell you what they eat and what you find them on. But when we were trying to figure out what does a juvenile of a particular species look like, because we were surveying, we didn't really know our grasshoppers, so we kept taking extensive notes on the features of a juvenile to be able to see what is it going to turn into. So I had no idea what special diet to feed them. So I had a student, and the student goes, well, I'll try. And the student gave them lettuce, he gave them grass, and then he gave them dandelions. And we were able to rear out all of the different species. So I do think that they may have preferences, and you might find them eating particular things in the environment. And so much of the literature tells you that. But I think if push comes to shove, they can be flexible.
Okay, anyone else have questions? Okay, I'll turn this over to Cheryl. Oh, we have one last minute one. Food availability is often low in hot, dry years on prairies in Colorado, but at elevations, food is rarely unavailable. Did you account?
Food as in, you mean like grass or? Sorry.
I'm guessing so.
So I do think it's hard to know what to account, and there's so much that we can do with the food that I think it's a really great question. Like, what are they eating, and are they shifting, and what are the nutrients that are in these plants depending on a really warm year or not so warm. So for example, at Chautauqua Mesa, when we were in the year where they did not do very well, it truly was like walking on cornflakes when you're doing the survey, because a lot of the plants had dried out and the plants were extremely small. So I absolutely think that food availability is important. Lower down, higher up, I did not see those dramatic changes, but I wouldn't be surprised. But I definitely think that that's another phase of this project that I was not able to explore. Thank you for the question.
Okay, now I will pass it. Oh, one last one, I guess, before we pass it to Cheryl. Did you find any variations in species identity between historic surveys and yours?
So that's a great question. And one of the things that we tried so there were some species that have had their names changed that we had to go and just change their name, like Melanopus mexicanus. It's sanguinipes now. And then there was another species that I kept calling something because he always found it there. And then it turns out when I look closely, the species that he had described along the gradient is no longer there. It's actually been replaced by another species that used to be lower down. But other than that, we haven't really had a lot of movement of species changing their distribution along the gradient.
Perfect, thank you so much. Okay, Cheryl.
Right. Well, while it's been my honor to serve as president this year, even under the strangest of circumstances, it's also my honor to welcome and install the incoming president. And so with that, I am handing the gavel over to Jamie Zonizer. There you go, Jamie.
Cheryl. So my makeshift gavel here. Thanks very much. I don't have a whole lot to say right now, just mostly thanks to some people. Thanks to Cece for our outgoing program chair for your service over the past couple of years, I think. And also thank you very much. Cece has also volunteered to help us out with the Zoom presentations for the foreseeable future. So thank you, Cece, for that. So of course, she'll be continuing to be active with the society. Thank you to Christina Say for your service as Membership and Communications Secretary. That's a big job. And so we definitely appreciate your work on that. Thank you to the newly elected officers who accepted the nominations. Thank you, Lourdes, I see you out there. Also, thank you to Al Norabaum for stepping up to be program chair, and to Elizabeth Young as the new Membership and Communications Secretary. And also thanks to the other incumbent officers for agreeing to continue in their roles. Of course, look forward to working with all of you. I want to give a little shout out to the nominating committee. Thanks for putting the nominations together. That was David Dansky, Stuart McCamey, and Paul Goldstein. Thank you, guys. And also to the auditing committee. They're the ones that review the finances that were Abby Kulip worked so hard to put together. So she's our treasurer, and she submitted all the financial reports to the auditing committee. And the auditing committee was Jung Kim, we know as fondly known as Woogie, Dennis Kopp, and Ben Proshek. So thank you guys for your work on the auditing committee to review the finances. Finally, I'd also like to thank Cheryl. Thank you so much for your leadership this year. It's been, of course, a difficult year in so many different ways, and we've kind of all figured out our way through it. And I think a lot of good things are coming from it. This Zoom format, I think, certainly, as you can see right now, it gives the potential for all members of our society to participate in the meeting. So I think that's one really good benefit, and we hope to continue even hopefully as we eventually when we resume in-person meetings. Of course, Cheryl's not going away. So if you don't know, as the way it works with the presidential officers, so for first year, you're president-elect. Next year, you're president, and then the following year, you're past president. And so she still serves on the committee, and so she's going to be our source of wisdom for the next year. So she's still around, and of course we'll go to her for pieces of advice. Also, thank you to Mark Metz, which he was the this past year's past president, and also the current editor of Proceedings of the Entomological Society of Washington, and also the webmaster. So he's still very active in a lot of different ways in the society. So thanks to him. And that's about it. Looking forward to the new year. We'll see what it will bring. I'm sure there will be many changes, but for the foreseeable future, we're going to be doing this Zoom format. And so far, I think it's going well. It's really encouraging to see the participation out there. Thank you, César, so much for an awesome presentation tonight. That was great. That was really cool, impressive. Without further ado, does anybody have any last comments or questions or anything? Okay, do we have a motion to adjourn the meeting?
Motion.
And second? Second, okay. Meeting adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Bye.
Lourdes, can I ask you a question? Off your right shoulder in the bookcase, are those field guides to birds? Right down just a bit. Yeah, right there.
Yes, bunch of bird books.
Yeah, they look very familiar.
And these are all records.
Gee, I remember those. I sent my entire collection to a brother in Colorado. You can send them by media rate. 46 pounds of albums cost me $4 to ship.
Wow.
Yeah. I had to take the sheet from the domestic mail manual with me to the post office to persuade them that it actually is audio recordings, which comes under media mail. He was so happy to get those. I was so happy to get the space out of my closet.
Oh, yeah.
Sorry, I know this isn't entomological, but I have shelves that look just like that over your shoulder. I retired from leading bird tours almost 2 years ago. Hey, Matt.
Oh, really?
Yeah. If anyone has records they want to donate to our collection, I keep them all curated and I database them by who donated them. So you can always get them back if you want, but we're a great holding repository for records.
Well, there's
just putting it all out there, you know.
Type of high fidelity players coming out lately too.
Yeah, whole bunch.
Yeah, but going back to birds, just to quickly, there's an app called Merlin. If you guys don't know, I don't know anything about birds. I'm learning, and I've always tried with the books, but Merlin is excellent. And I think we can do something like that with insects, hopefully in the future, where you just give the certain size and where you saw it, what it was doing. And it gives you a really good suggestion of what it could be. So anyway, for birders.
Yeah, that's a Cornell.
Yeah, Cornell.
Yeah.
We've been putting the bugs we find into iNaturalist, which is another app that's real fun. And it's great at identifying, although we still have a centipede that we cannot figure out. But highly recommended, and you place it on the map where you found it. And so then other like scientists can come and verify whether you've picked the correct identification.
Yeah. No, it's a very helpful app.
Yeah.
They're doing, I saw this really interesting thing where they're actually now having identification of plants. So people are looking at iNaturalist pictures and matching the insect to the plant based on the computer IDs. And so that's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Now, if it would just give us a barcode as well. Well, thank you all. César, it was excellent. Makes me wish I'd kept the grasshoppers and instead of just the snail killing flies when I was out in Fort Collins collecting a couple of years ago. But maybe that wouldn't have been useful because it wasn't exactly the area where you were collecting.
I think they're always useful in museums. There's always someone who wants DNA or wants to look at what body size is of a particular thing that might be somewhere. So yeah.
I was trying to figure out where you are because it's still daylight.
Oh, right. I just decided to be casual so that people could relax and eat if they needed to. We used to meet friends for wine at a particular cafe, and we can't do it anymore. So we get our wine backgrounds, and then we get our wine and just talk. So.
That's great. That's great.
Yeah.
Oh, and just to remind everyone, if you're really into beetles, tomorrow is the Coleoptera Society meeting. It starts at noon at Eastern Standard Time, and there should be a lot of very interesting presentations and lots of awards, and mainly two that will be talking about Terry Irwin's legacy. So it should be pretty good. And you just register, go online, go to the website, the Coleoptera Society website, and you can register. It's free, so it's great. And because it's Zoom and it's all digital, there's going to be people from all over the world that we perhaps have read their names, but that never had the chance to meet. And then there's going to be a small social at the end, which will be really awesome to be able to talk to and meet people like that. So my announcement.
Very nice.
Could you post a link to learn more about that event tomorrow?
Yeah, let me look for it right now. And
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you for inviting me.
Nice, Cesar. Very nice presentation.
Thank you. I look forward to other meetings as well. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Thank you for the invite.
Okay.
Noon to 6 p.m.
event details. So I'll put this one quickly here in the chat for everyone, and this will take you to the meetings, to the events. And if you go down, click here to register. There's a link there. Click here to register for the 2020 annual meeting of the Coleoptera Society.
Perfect. I'll let everyone take a
I
second.
see it.
Okay. I will be closing the meeting.
All
Bye,
right.
everyone.
Thanks so
Bye.
much.
Yep.
Stay safe.
Bye.
Bye-bye.